It was the 25th of June, 1999. Inside Long Island Medical Center, one of New York's wealthiest real estate magnates drew his final breath. At 93, Fred Trump, the man who had built a quiet empire of bricks and mortgages, passed away, leaving behind a fortune that would soon tear his family apart. Within hours, his children gathered to study the details of his will. His signature, once a symbol of power, was now a silent key that would decide who inherited the vast property portfolio he had spent nearly 7 decades assembling. But in the days that followed, grief gave way to resentment. Lawsuits emerged, pitting sibling against sibling, and soon the name Trump was again making headlines. Not for skyscrapers or politics, but for an inheritance war. And so began the final chapter of Fred Trump's story. A man who, long before his son's fame, built the foundations of a dynasty that would one day reach the White House. Fred Trump's life had begun in humbler surroundings. He was born on October 11, 1905, in the Bronx, New York City. Baptized as Frederick Christ Trump, a name that seemed almost ironic for a man whose faith would later be business itself. His father, Frederick Trump, was a German immigrant from Bavaria, a man who embodied the raw ambition of the late 19th century. Frederick had crossed the Atlantic in 1885 at just 16, one of millions fleeing poverty and chasing opportunity in the Americas. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Europe, but it had also displaced countless families. For Frederick, America promised freedom and profit. In Manhattan, he worked as a barber, saving what little he could. But like many restless dreamers, he was drawn by rumors from the West, whispers of gold, of fortune, of unclaimed lands. By 1891, he had made his way to Seattle, and soon after to a mining town called Monte Cristo. There he ran a string of restaurants and boarding houses catering to the rugged miners chasing the Klondike gold rush. He never struck gold himself, but he did something more practical. He sold meals, rooms, and shovels to the men who did. "It's better to sell the pickaxe than to swing it," he would tell others. By the end of the decade, Frederick Trump had built a small fortune, the first spark of the Trump family's wealth. When he returned to Germany in 1901 to marry Elizabeth Christ, he dreamed of settling back in the old country. But fate and bureaucracy intervened. Bavarian authorities discovered he had left years earlier to avoid compulsory military service. Threatened with the loss of his citizenship, he and Elizabeth fled back to New York. Their first child, Elizabeth, was born in 1904. A year later came Fred, the second child of a man who had made his fortune in the dust and chaos of the frontier. In 1907, a third, John, completed the family. By the standards of immigrant life in early 20th century New York, the Trumps were fortunate. While many newcomers crowded into the tenements of the Lower East Side, living among coal dust and disease, the Trumps lived comfortably in the South Bronx, in one of the city's new housing developments. They had private bathrooms, an icebox, even building staff who delivered fuel to their apartment. It was a small symbol of middle-class success, but for Fred, it was also a sign of what was possible. His father, having given up barbering, used the savings he had made out west to buy property in Queens, across the East River. It was a gamble. Queens was still sparsely populated, but one that would soon pay off. When the Queensboro Bridge opened in 1909, connecting the borough to Manhattan, an exodus began. The city was expanding, and Frederick Trump was there to profit from it. Young Fred grew up in this world of steady expansion, where brick by brick, neighborhood by neighborhood, New York was remaking itself. He spoke German at home, but outside, the world was fast, English-speaking, and ruthlessly competitive. He later claimed he started working at age 8 or 9, though historians doubt the exact age. What is certain is that life changed drastically with the arrival of World War I. Anti-German sentiment spread through the United States after 1917. Surnames like Trump or Schmidt drew suspicion. Fred's family, who had always kept a low profile, withdrew even further. His father, Frederick, focused quietly on managing his few rental properties. But fate, once again, intervened. In May 1918, as war raged across Europe, the world was hit by another enemy, the Spanish flu. Though misnamed, the pandemic began not in Spain, but in Kansas, spreading swiftly through American army camps before crossing the Atlantic. Frederick Trump fell ill that spring. Within days, the 49-year-old man who had built the family's future was dead, likely one of the early victims of the flu. Fred was only 12. The loss of his father could have ended the Trump story right there, but instead it hardened it. Elizabeth Christ Trump, his widowed mother, refused to let her husband's work fade. With the help of her children, she kept the family's modest real estate business alive, collecting rents and maintaining the properties. Fred, meanwhile, finished school and graduated from Richmond Hill High in 1923. It would be the end of his formal education, but the beginning of a lifelong apprenticeship in money and construction. America was roaring into the 1920s, a decade of jazz, cars, and skyscrapers. For most, it was a time of easy credit and optimism. For Fred Trump, it was a classroom. He started working as a carpenter and construction laborer, learning every detail of how buildings were made, from the foundation to the finishing nails. He was barely 20 when he began building small homes on the leftover plots his father had purchased years ago. Because he was not yet old enough to inherit directly, the family business operated under the name Elizabeth Trump and Son. She signed the checks, he built the houses. Financing was difficult. Banks didn't rush to loan money to a teenager from Queens. So Fred worked one project at a time, selling one house to fund the next. By 1926, he had completed 19 homes, modest, sturdy, and practical, designed for the young families of post-war America. They weren't luxurious, but they represented something more enduring, the dream of stability. Fred Trump, in his quiet, methodical way, was building not just homes, but the foundation of a family fortune. By the late 1920s, Fred Trump was no longer just a young man with a hammer. He was an ambitious builder, a figure of quiet determination who saw opportunity where others saw empty lots and half-built streets. Queens was growing, brick by brick, into the dream of the American middle class, and Fred Trump intended to supply its walls. By 1929, he had completed dozens of small houses, each one financed through sweat and patience. They weren't grand, but they sold quickly, to teachers, mechanics, and young families climbing the social ladder. It seemed that nothing could slow his rise. Then, one October morning, the stock market collapsed. The Wall Street crash of 1929 was more than a financial disaster. It was a psychological one, the moment the jazz age stopped dancing. Banks failed, construction halted, fortunes disappeared overnight. And for young builders like Fred Trump, whose small company depended entirely on credit and optimism, it was a death sentence in slow motion. In Manhattan, skyscrapers that had symbolized boundless ambition now stood as monuments to greed. The brand new Empire State Building, planned before the crash, opened in 1931, its top floors empty for years. People called it the Empty State Building. For Fred, there was no market left for new homes. Demand evaporated. Credit dried up. But where many builders gave up or went bankrupt, he pivoted. If he couldn't build houses, he would build something people still needed: food. In the early 1930s, while America lined up for bread, Fred Trump built one of the first modern supermarkets in Queens. It was a small concrete building, unremarkable at first glance, but revolutionary in concept. Customers walked through the aisles and picked items off the shelves themselves, rather than ordering from a clerk behind the counter. In a decade defined by scarcity, Trump's store symbolized efficiency and modernity. It wasn't glamorous, and his heart was never truly in groceries. But it kept him afloat while the rest of the country floundered. He was waiting, watching, for the moment when America would start building again. That moment came in 1933. In Washington, a new president took the oath of office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man with a calm voice and radical ideas. The Great Depression had devastated millions, and Roosevelt's New Deal promised not just recovery but reinvention. Government money began to flow again into bridges, schools, and, most crucially for Fred Trump, housing. The National Housing Act of 1934 and the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, changed everything. For the first time, the federal government guaranteed mortgages and financed affordable housing on a large scale. To men like Fred, it was a golden door flung open. Trump moved quickly. In 1934, he purchased the mortgage book of a bankrupt Brooklyn firm, the J. Larencross Corporation, acquiring properties and land at bargain prices. Then he began building again, this time not one house at a time, but hundreds. By 1936, his crews were working non-stop, constructing entire blocks of modest brick homes across Queens and Brooklyn. Government subsidies and FHA loans gave him a scale of operation he could only have dreamed of 5 years earlier. The Great Depression had crushed his generation, but the New Deal made him rich. The newspapers began to take notice. One profile dubbed him the Henry Ford of the affordable housing market, a man who could mass-produce homes for the American middle class as Ford had done with cars. Fred Trump was still young, not yet 30, and his empire was taking shape. It was also during this decade that Fred met the woman who would become the matriarch of the Trump family, Mary Ann McLeod. She was a Scottish immigrant who had come to New York in 1930, escaping the poverty of the Outer Hebrides. The Great Depression had left her jobless and adrift, yet her spirit was unbroken. She and Fred met at a party, two immigrants' children whose lives had been shaped by hardship. They married on January 11, 1936. Together they would raise 5 children, Mary Ann, Fred Jr., Elizabeth, Donald, and Robert, and build a household as disciplined as the man who led it. Fred was a stern patriarch. He didn't drink, didn't smoke, and demanded the same restraint from his children. He ran the home as he ran his business, with rules, order, and constant oversight. Table manners mattered. Performance was expected. And, as the children later remembered, love was often shown through structure, not softness. Mary, gentle but firm, kept the family together. Behind the rigid walls of the Trump household, discipline became destiny. By the end of the 1930s, Fred Trump's reputation was solid. His company, now one of the largest private builders in New York, had benefited immensely from federal money. Yet, for all his success, there was controversy too. In June 1927, the New York Times had reported an incident that would later resurface decades later. A Ku Klux Klan rally in Queens that turned violent, leading to multiple arrests. Among those detained was a Fred Trump of Devonshire Road. Whether he was a participant, a bystander, or simply caught in the chaos remains uncertain. He was never charged, and the incident faded. But the shadow of that moment lingered. Decades later, it would be cited as evidence of the racial divisions that haunted both his housing projects and the America he helped build. Still, Fred pressed on, undeterred. He built through controversy, through rumor, through the tides of politics. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the U.S. economy shifted once again, this time toward war production. At first, it seemed like a threat to Fred's housing business. But as the nation prepared for battle, the government needed homes for soldiers, workers, and military staff. The Federal Housing Administration, the same institution that had made Fred wealthy during the New Deal, now redirected its money to build housing for defense workers and Navy families. Fred adapted once more, securing contracts to build thousands of military apartments, especially in Norfolk, Virginia, home to the U.S. Navy's largest base. It was a brilliant move. The government paid for the construction, but allowed builders to keep ownership after the war. Fred Trump had found the perfect business model, government-funded, privately owned, and permanently profitable. By 1945, he owned more than 1,500 apartments in Norfolk alone. When peace returned, he was a multi-millionaire. Fred Trump's rise was not the story of chance. It was the story of a man who saw systems and learned to work within them. Where others saw regulation, he saw opportunity. Where others saw risk, he saw structure. His success was not about vision in the artistic sense. It was about precision, persistence, and an almost mathematical instinct for profit. He would never become a celebrity or a political icon,
But by the dawn of the 1940s, the foundations of the Trump empire were firmly in place, built on red bricks, federal dollars, and an unrelenting belief that the world rewarded those who built, not those who dreamed.
When the 1940s began, the world was once again sliding into chaos. Europe was burning. Hitler's armies had overrun Poland, France, and much of the continent. And though the United States had not yet entered the war, the tension was already reshaping its economy. Factories converted to weapons production. Steel and copper were rationed. And in cities like New York, construction was no longer about glamour or skyline ambition. It was about necessity. For Fred Trump, it was a moment of disruption and opportunity. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, everything changed overnight. America was at war, and every nail, every brick, every carpenter now had a new purpose. The government, through the Federal Housing Administration, began funding enormous housing programs for military families, especially around naval and defense bases. Fred Trump, who had mastered the system during the New Deal, was perfectly positioned. He won contracts to build housing for the U.S. Navy in Norfolk, Virginia, and other coastal cities. It was a massive operation. Hundreds of workers, thousands of apartments, all financed by federal money. The terms were extraordinary. The government covered construction costs, and when the war ended, the developers could retain ownership. In other words, Fred Trump was being paid to build an empire he would then own. By 1945, he had built nearly 1,500 apartments in Norfolk alone. Thousands more followed in New York. It was the kind of success that could only exist in wartime America, when private ambition and public need collided. And yet, in his own way, Fred Trump was giving back. He wasn't just building for profit. He was helping house the men and women who were fighting to preserve the world's freedom. Though, as with everything Fred did, business came first. The war years also transformed his personal life. Fred's young family was growing. Mary Ann, the Scottish immigrant who had crossed an ocean for a better life, was now the center of a sprawling household. Their first daughter, Mary Ann, had been born in 1937. Then came Fred Jr. in 1938, Elizabeth in 1942, Donald in 1946, and finally Robert in 1948. The Trump home in Jamaica Estates, Queens, was comfortable but ruled with precision. Fred's children later remembered a house where rules were sacred, where their father's authority filled every room. He was the kind of man who believed discipline was love, and success the only form of affection. Dinner was formal. Every child had chores. Their mother, gentle but devout, reported misbehavior to Fred each evening. He was strict but predictable, a man who valued control, order, and quiet achievement. He never drank, he never gambled. And, perhaps more than anything, he never forgot where he came from, the child of German immigrants who had clawed their way out of poverty through real estate. Religion ran deep in the Trump home. Fred was a Lutheran, Mary a Presbyterian. They raised their children in the Protestant ethic of thrift and hard work. On Sundays, the family attended church without fail. Later, Fred became a devoted follower of Billy Graham, the famous Southern Baptist evangelist whose fiery sermons captivated mid-century America. In public, Fred appeared reserved, even cold. But within that austerity lay a sharp intelligence and a sense of purpose that defined everything he touched. By the late 1940s, the war was over and America was changing again. Millions of soldiers returned home, ready to start families. Cities swelled, suburbs spread, and the United States stood on the brink of a golden age. The GI Bill and federal housing programs created an unprecedented demand for affordable homes. For Fred Trump, this was not a challenge. It was an invitation. The same government that had financed his wartime construction now poured money into post-war housing for returning veterans. Fred shifted his focus back to New York,
purchasing land in Queens and Brooklyn, neighborhoods like Bensonhurst, Brighton Beach, and Bath Beach. But the post-war years came with their own frustrations. America was at peace, but not yet efficient. Factories were still converting back from military production. Simple materials, bathtubs, radiators, copper pipes were hard to find. Fred's work ethic, however, never wavered. He worked 7 days a week, personally inspecting building sites, driving his own car to supervise progress. His workers said he had a hawk's eye for profit. He raised prices when costs soared, but buyers didn't complain. They trusted the Trump name. By 1947, crowds lined up to see the model homes of his new development at Bath Beach. They were modest, sturdy, and reliable, homes for people who wanted to start families and build lives. Fred was not an artist. He didn't build to impress. He built to endure. The 1950s brought prosperity, and with it, power. The federal housing system that Roosevelt had built 2 decades ago was still in place, and no one knew how to work it better than Fred Trump. He maintained close ties with the FHA, especially Thomas Grace, the agency's New York director. The two dined regularly at Grace's favorite restaurant, where deals were made over simple meals and quiet handshakes. Government support continued to pour into Fred's projects. He built entire communities, rows of red brick buildings, courtyards, and tree-lined streets, designed to house the growing American middle class. His developments were often criticized for their uniformity, but they were affordable, efficient, and profitable. By the mid-1950s, Fred Trump was a millionaire many times over. Most of his wealth wasn't cash, it was property. Thousands of apartments and homes across Queens, Brooklyn, and Norfolk brought in steady rent. He didn't sell them. He didn't need to. All he had to do was wait, and the checks would come. But wealth brought scrutiny. Folk singer Woody Guthrie, who once rented an apartment in Fred's Beach Haven complex, wrote a bitter protest song titled "Old Man Trump." In it, Guthrie accused his landlord of fostering racial segregation, a charge that, while not unique to Trump, reflected the systemic racism of mid-century housing policies. The New Deal, for all its progress, had institutionalized segregation through redlining, a federal practice that denied loans to black neighborhoods. Builders like Fred benefited from this system, whether or not they personally enforced it. Still, reports suggested that Trump's policies often excluded African American tenants. Fred never publicly commented on such accusations. For him, business was business, and controversy was noise. By the end of the 1950s, Fred Trump had achieved what his immigrant father could only have dreamed of. He had built an empire out of bricks and mortgages, one subsidized by the very government programs designed to lift the poor. He was a paradox, a self-made man who had mastered the art of using public money for private gain. His property stretched across 2 states. His family lived in comfort. His name, once that of an obscure builder in Queens, had become synonymous with power. But Fred was not the type to slow down. As the world entered the turbulent 1960s, he began to plan the future, not just of his business, but of his legacy. He had built for the American dream. Now he wanted to make sure his children inherited it, intact, unchallenged, and everlasting.
By the dawn of the 1960s, Fred Trump was a man at the height of his power. He was in his mid-50s, sharp, methodical, and unshakably confident, presiding over a real estate empire that stretched across New York and beyond. Thousands of red brick homes stood as monuments to his discipline. Each apartment building, each row of identical houses was a quiet testimony to a man who believed success came not from risk, but from control. Yet Fred Trump was not a man to celebrate success. He was already thinking about succession. In 1965, he turned 60. The average American life expectancy was barely 70. Fred began to plan what every patriarch eventually must. Who would inherit the empire he had built? The Trump Organization, once Elizabeth Trump and Son, had grown into a sprawling enterprise handling construction, rentals, and property management across Queens, Brooklyn, and Norfolk, Virginia. The business was stable, wealthy, and deeply conservative in its approach. But Fred knew stability could die with its creator if not carefully passed on. He had 5 children, but only the sons could carry the name. Or so he believed. Mary Ann, his eldest, was brilliant and independent. She studied law and later became a respected federal judge, one of the few women in American history to hold such a position. Elizabeth, quiet and steady, took a job at Chase Manhattan Bank, preferring numbers to buildings. That left the boys, Fred Jr., Donald, and Robert, to carry the family torch. At first, Fred Jr., Freddie, as the family called him, seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps. He was handsome, charming, and well-liked. Fred made him a vice president of the company in the mid-1960s, grooming him for leadership. But Freddie was different from his father. He was warm where Fred was hard, idealistic where Fred was practical. He didn't love real estate. He loved the skies. He wanted to become a pilot. To Fred Trump, this was incomprehensible, even insulting. He had built everything with his hands and his rules. Flying airplanes, to him, was not a career. It was a distraction, a hobby for men without purpose. Tensions grew. Fred belittled his eldest son's ambitions, criticizing him publicly, mocking him privately. The more Freddie tried to please his father, the more he failed. Eventually, Freddie left the Trump Organization and pursued flying full-time. He became a commercial pilot with Trans World Airlines. For a moment, he was happy, truly happy, but his father's disapproval haunted him. He began to drink heavily. The warmth that once made him so beloved turned inward, into guilt and bitterness. His younger brother Donald watched it all unfold and learned. By the late 1960s, Donald was in his early 20s, freshly graduated from the Wharton School of Finance. He admired his father, but wanted more. Not just money, but fame. He was ambitious in a way Fred both recognized and feared. Donald was brash, loud, and bold, everything Fred was not. Where the father built quietly, the son dreamed loudly. Where Fred saw risk, Donald saw headlines. In 1968, Fred brought him into the Trump Organization, giving him a desk, a title, and a chance to learn the business from the inside. It was a pivotal year. America was on fire with protests, assassinations, and a generational divide that mirrored the one inside the Trump family. Fred taught Donald the old rules about discipline, about leverage, about control. But he also passed down something darker, a worldview shaped by dominance and fear. Fred often told Donald he had to be a killer in business. Never show weakness, never back down, never trust anyone completely. Meetings in the Trump offices were almost psychological warfare. Fred positioned chairs unevenly, placing his guests where sunlight blinded their eyes, where the wobble of the seat made them uneasy. Negotiation to him was theater, and he always had the lead role. Donald watched and absorbed every lesson. But deep down, he wanted to outgrow his father's world, to step out of Queens, away from the red bricks, and into the glittering heart of Manhattan. Meanwhile, Freddie's story was unraveling. His drinking worsened. His marriage to Linda Clapp fell apart. He returned to the family business not as an executive, but as a handyman, managing properties while Donald rose higher. It was a quiet humiliation, one that everyone in the Trump household understood but never spoke about. By the late 1970s, Freddie's health had deteriorated. In 1981, he died from an alcohol-related heart attack at just 42 years old. His death devastated some in the family, but Fred's reaction was complicated. He mourned, but he didn't linger. To him, life and business moved forward. His eldest son had failed, but another had risen to take his place.
For Donald Trump, Freddie's death was a warning. He never touched alcohol again, telling others he'd seen what it could do. But more than that, it cemented his role as heir. Fred now poured his energy into Donald. He saw in him the same drive he had once had, magnified by modern ambition. By 1971, Fred made it official. Donald Trump was named president of the Trump Organization. But the title was not yet power. Fred remained deeply involved, controlling most of the assets and decisions behind the scenes. It was a partnership, sometimes functional, often tense. Donald wanted to do what his father had never dared: break into Manhattan, the jewel of American real estate. Fred had avoided it for decades, calling it risky, overvalued, full of sharks. But Donald craved its prestige. He didn't just want to build, he wanted to be seen building. And so, with Fred's cautious blessing and financial backing, he began his first major Manhattan project, the Commodore Hotel redevelopment near Grand Central Station. The deal was enormous, $70 million, half of it personally guaranteed by Fred. For the father, a gamble. For the son, a declaration of independence. When the hotel reopened in 1980 as the Grand Hyatt, it was an instant success. Fred had built an empire of brick and mortar. Donald had built one of marble and headlines. Fred's cautious empire builder had raised a showman. In private, Fred still worried. Donald borrowed aggressively, spent lavishly, and sought constant attention. It was everything he had taught his son not to do. But there was also pride, the thrill of seeing the Trump name glitter on Fifth Avenue. The skyscraper Donald built soon after, Trump Tower, completed in 1983, was not just a building. It was a symbol. Sleek, mirrored, golden. A monument to ambition and to the lessons, good and bad, that Fred had passed down. Standing beneath its shadow, Fred Trump could look at the skyline and know that one way or another, his name would never be forgotten.
By the early 1980s, Fred Trump was an old man, but still sharp, still watching, still calculating. He had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the rise and fall of empires. But now, in his twilight years, he faced a different kind of uncertainty, one born not from the economy, but from family. His son Donald had become a phenomenon, the brash young mogul of Manhattan, all cameras and confidence. While Fred had built quietly, Donald built loudly. He appeared in glossy magazines, posed for photos beside models and marble lobbies, and spoke in sweeping boasts about billions and towers. For a man who had once refused to decorate his office walls with anything but blueprints, Fred now saw his family name glowing in gold letters across Fifth Avenue. Part of him admired it. Another part of him feared it. Donald's empire, unlike his father's, was built on borrowed money, enormous loans and speculative deals. The elder Trump had always relied on slow, steady profit. Rents collected month by month, properties owned outright, debts paid in full. Donald's world was different. It was built on leverage, publicity, and risk, the 3 things Fred had spent his life avoiding. Still, father and son were bound together, by blood, by business, by pride. As the 1980s roared on, the Trump Organization expanded aggressively into Manhattan's high-end market. Donald bought hotels, casinos, and skyscrapers. He was everywhere, hosting press conferences, appearing on television, cultivating the image of success that America wanted to believe in. He was the son of a cautious builder, but he had become a symbol of the new decade, bold, glitzy, and unapologetically ambitious. Fred, meanwhile, maintained the family's vast real estate portfolio in Queens and Brooklyn, thousands of rental units that generated millions in annual income. He didn't need the spotlight, he never had. But the headlines would soon turn dark. In October 1987, the illusion cracked. On Black Monday, the stock market plunged in one of the worst crashes in modern history. Manhattan's property values, inflated by years of speculation, began to crumble. Donald's empire, built on fragile credit, began to tremble. Fred, now in his 80s, watched as his son's fortunes wavered. He had seen this before. In 1929, when the Great Depression had wiped out builders across the country. But this time, it wasn't his own future at risk, it was his son's. Donald had borrowed hundreds of millions to finance new hotels and casinos, especially in Atlantic City. He was overextended. The economy tightened, interest rates rose, and the glamour began to fade. By 1990, Donald Trump, once hailed as a genius of real estate, was on the brink of collapse. Fred stepped in. It was a quiet intervention, the kind that never made the front page. In December 1990, Fred sent one of his lawyers, Howard Snyder, to Donald's Trump Castle Casino in Atlantic City. Snyder walked in, bought 670 gray casino chips, each worth $5,000, a total of $3.35 million, and left without gambling a single hand. It was an elegant way to inject cash into Donald's struggling operation without triggering tax scrutiny. The chips were technically purchased assets, not gifts. A few days later, Snyder repeated the act with another $150,000. Fred Trump, the master of systems, had found one last loophole to save his son. The New Jersey Casino Control Commission wasn't amused. Donald was fined $65,000. But the message was clear. Even in old age, Fred was still the safety net beneath the Trump dynasty. By now, Fred's health was failing. He was in his mid-80s, still walking with the stubborn dignity of a man who refused to retire, but his memory was fading. In October 1991, doctors diagnosed him with the early stages of dementia. For a man who had built his life on precision, the slow erosion of his mind was a quiet tragedy. Yet he continued to appear at family events, still dignified in his suit and tie, still signing documents with the same deliberate handwriting. When Donald married Marla Maples in December 1993, Fred served as best man, though he reportedly had to be reminded why he was there. The patriarch of the Trump empire, once so commanding, was slipping away. In those years, Donald's empire, too, was unraveling. He declared multiple bankruptcies as his casinos and hotels collapsed under debt. The Plaza Hotel, one of his crown jewels, was lost. For Fred, it must have felt like déjà vu. The same economic storms he had weathered in his youth, now battering his heir. Still, the old man remained a pillar. Even in decline, his presence anchored the family. By the late 1990s, Fred's dementia had worsened. He often forgot faces, sometimes even those of his own grandchildren. Yet the empire he had built remained solid. His properties continued to generate millions. The red brick buildings of Queens and Brooklyn still stood as monuments to his lifetime of discipline. In June 1999, pneumonia struck. Fred was hospitalized at the Long Island Jewish Medical Center. Donald visited often, sometimes quiet, sometimes distracted, as the world's cameras still followed his every move. On June 25, 1999, at the age of 93, Fred Trump died. The man who had built a dynasty from the dust of the Great Depression was gone. His funeral was held in Manhattan, attended by his children and grandchildren. He was laid to rest in a family plot in Middle Village, Queens, the borough he had turned into a kingdom. But even in death, Fred Trump's story did not end. In the weeks that followed, old wounds reopened. Fred's will, a carefully drafted document meant to ensure fairness, became the source of bitter family conflict. His eldest son, Freddie, had died years earlier, leaving two children, Fred Trump III and Mary Trump. They believed their grandfather had intended to include them in his estate. But when the will was read, they discovered they had been largely written out. A legal battle erupted. Fred III and Mary accused Donald, Marianne, and Robert of manipulating their father's estate, taking advantage of Fred's mental decline to alter the inheritance. The Trump family, heirs to millions, were now suing one another.
The dispute tore open old divisions. In the end, a settlement was reached, but the damage remained. Mary Trump would later write that her family had not just lost an inheritance, they had lost any illusion of unity. As the new millennium approached, the Trump name, once confined to Queens, now echoed across the world. Fred Trump's methods, his discipline, and his ambition had shaped everything that came after. Without him, there would be no Trump Tower, no casino empire, no future president bearing the family name. He was not glamorous, he was not charming, but he was relentless. He embodied the cold genius of 20th century American capitalism, a man who saw housing not as homes, but as opportunity, who turned government policy into private fortune, who raised children in the image of his own iron will. In many ways, Fred Trump was the architect not just of buildings, but of a dynasty, one that would transform American politics, culture, and the very idea of success. His empire began with a barber son from Bavaria and ended with a son in the White House. The bricks of Queens had built a monument that stretched all the way to Washington, D.C. Epilogue. Fred Trump's story is the American story of migration, ambition, and the thin line between discipline and dominance. He was a man of his time, conservative, industrious, often harsh, but undeniably effective. His legacy is complicated, his methods controversial, his influence inescapable. History may remember his son, Donald, as the face of the empire. But the foundation, the quiet, unyielding foundation, was always Fred's.